Hello world, Powder Team back at it again. I am, behind the avatar here because my camera refuses to acknowledge my existence, which I find upsetting. But anyway, we will sally forth. I am Nige Coach, with me I have Nige Glenn, and we're doing some catch up here. All right, on the CNC. So Glenn, let's talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. How can this concept be helpful? How can it be problematic? How does a truth seeker understand it?
All right. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theory in psychology which places the drivers of the human condition in a rough 5-tier sequence of food, shelter, community, self-esteem, and then self-actualization. This can help a person to understand the scientific spirituality index and the 4 channels of synamnia that comprise it, constituting one's overall mental focus drivers. It can be problematic because of usually the assertions being made regarding the 4 channels of synamnia and how they line up from pragmatic to aspirational are being done without yet accounting for the Mojo phenomenon, limiting it to a coarse observational methodology that focuses on superficial surface behavior, which leads to core mistakes such as having more or less than 4 synamnia channels, placing pragmatic above aspirational as the overall more pervasive and influential of needs, or assigning a single peak pathway channel priority sequence to all people. Proper truth seeker acknowledges the forensic fact of the Mojo phenomenon, including the synamnia channels that are creating all the surface behaviors people are exhibiting, and clearly shows that Mojos have 4 channels of synamnia that come in different specialized rank sequences with an equal overall emphasis on pragmatic and aspirational when looked at from a species-wide context.
All right, so when you are ready.
Yeah, I think his way of approaching it was mainly focused on you need to get your survival down first before you can start going up from there. But It's kind of a little bit
you're actually doing
if you look at it, yeah. If you look at it from a purely how does this compare to Mojo, then you can find obviously things wrong with it, because then it's kind of saying that literal is more important than interpretive, logical is more important than values-based, in the sense that these things come before those things. Those are the things that you get to enjoy after, and yeah.
And also, the way it's set up, it's basically set like a pyramid, so that not only does it come first, it's also the base. It's the larger portion of your existence. And then, like aspirational stuff, self-development or self-actualization, that's that little tippy tip on the top of the pyramid.
Yeah.
So it's last and small.
Yeah. I think, I don't know if he did that intentionally, but yeah. That seems like, if you look at it from that perspective, that could definitely be incorrect, yeah. Because it's supposed to be even, right?
Yeah, it actually is even. I think just the conceptualization, it kind of gets into Jung, for example, was trying to read the qualia, and he was hit by the, I think a lot by animation and refrainment, which are easier to see. And so that's what kind of jumped out to him, because he's
subjective, yeah.
Yes, he wasn't really noting momentum modulation. He was noting animation and refrainment. And as you know, for example, the momentum of Nye isn't very demonstrative. So, you know what I mean? One has to separate between the two. It's the same thing here, is I think it's seeing what animals do. For example, naked afraid. Naked afraid is kind of good at analogy here, because they're put in a survival situation. If you just sort of analyze their time in a primitive way, they're spending a lot of time gathering food, gathering wood, basic necessity kinds of things. But actually, the social interaction, it pervades the whole thing. It helps decide which avenues of inquiry they pursue and how well they get along and bonus stack each other throughout the process. And then also the ideas, they're generating ideas as they're doing it. But if you're kind of looking for more obvious things, you're seeing a person spend most of their day gathering water and firewood. You know what I mean? So if you kind of just go on obvious visuals, oh, they're doing V most of the day. Most of the day was getting water and getting wood. That's just physical grunt work.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, that makes sense. You can't have just one or the other, or you can't have it so that you're focusing on just one thing and like you can only focus on the other things once you have that completely down.
Yes.
They're always going to be like, you're always working on everything at the same time. It's never like, you know, you have one thing and then you're turn that off. Now you got to work on this other thing. It's kind of like, you know, like the way you can't just use single power in isolation. It's the same kind of thing here. You're constantly using all of them at the same time.
Exactly.
Focusing on social interactions. Yeah, it's just at certain times in certain periods, like if you find yourself alone every now and then, there's going to be more subjective activity, more like detachment or whatever, that sort of thing, more recollection. Versus when you're interacting with the rest of the tribe, then it's going to be more obviously, you know, dynamic, smoother, and that sort of thing.
Exactly. And there are some looser interpretations of the hierarchy, but they generally still had that kind of sequential turning on or sequential importance.
Yeah. It's kind of like gives you a good rough understanding, but it's incomplete. It's kind of like this.
It's kind of like an analogy I'd give is sort of like looking at sports. And what they say, like in sports, is you have the tangibles and the intangibles. Tangibles are, you know, how big they are, how fast they run a 40-yard dash, how much they can bench press, you know, things like this. But there are other intangible things, like, for example, being able to read the other players on the field, being able to be creative, do body movements that even experienced athletes didn't see coming. So there's actually those intangible things, though, that takes, you know, kind of like in sports analysis. I'm watching sports shows now to get my, you know, a little more of my sports on as far as understanding the bubbles. And that's when they often criticize people whose understanding of what happened in the game. They're like, you're just focusing on the tangibles. You're just focusing on the bodies moving around. You know what I mean? How many, you know, minutes a person was in. But 2 minutes of a certain person being in at a certain time, there is a lot of cultural stuff with their team. That when that person came in, the whole mood of the team changed. Everyone's performance changed. Do you know what I mean? So there's the intangible and tangible elements, and they're happening simultaneously, even in a full-on sport match. The intangibles are still there, but it takes some more subtle reading of what's going on to note them. It's easier just to go, oh, there's 3 people over there, 2 people over there, now 1 person has the ball. You know, just kind of noting how objects, including the human body, is acting in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more that actually even on nature channels when they watch animals, because, you know, a couple decades ago, and we still need more, but there was a lot of evidence in video and pictures and such of animals. And now, like, they have like cameras watching animals 24/7, or, you know, they're even rare animals sometimes. So long story short is that's good, but there's still a lot of how animals behave, all species, that doesn't explain enough. And thus, again, you have to start accounting for the intangibles. There must be some intangible aspect of why certain species do certain things that explains what they're doing beyond just the gross physical things in their environment themselves.
Yeah, definitely. Because there are certain things that animals do sometimes, like I've noticed, that kind of like, well, why would it do that? You know, it doesn't seem to make sense, or there's something weird about it, but it kind of like is a thing.
So
very, yeah,
there.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut it. Was that what you're saying? I just was like agreeing.
Yeah, I didn't actually catch what you said there a little bit.
I was just agreeing with you what I thought you were saying, which is that, yeah, there's some influence there for that to happen of some kind.
Exactly, yeah. There's definitely, like, you know, I think like a mojo phenomenon kind of like underneath the hood of even animals and stuff, and like what they're doing. But even not even that, although this is also related to it, it's sort of like, you know, animals and sexual selection. That's an interesting phenomenon in and of itself. Like, why do peacocks, like, you know, the big thing? That's kind of like, it doesn't really serve much of a purpose. It kind of seems like an inhibiting, but it's sort of like still functional. It's still like they like it, the female peacocks. I think there was even like a species that actually went extinct because the females kept. Oh, it was like a deer or something. They kept wanting bigger horns, and then eventually they got so big that they couldn't survive anymore as a species, and then they all went extinct. So that's how strong it can be.
Yeah,
like, yeah.
True, for sure.
Crazy. All right, let me see if I can do this one. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs is basically a system, a 5-tier system that goes from food, shelter, community, self-esteem, and then self-actualization. And then I think there's even a 6th one, like there's some of them like transcendent or something, I don't know. And there's basically like a 5-tier system where you acknowledge the basic necessities that a person needs, and then you work your way up to necessities that are not as much, according to the theory, as needed, not as important, and you kind of like need to get your base stuff out of the way first before you can move up this kind of like conceptual ladder. And it's good in the sense that it gets a person to understand the scientific spirituality index, and it also helps a person understand in a rough kind of a way the 4 channels of the psyche: interpretive, values-based, logic-based, and then literal. Although roughly, because they have 5, and Adler has 4. So that's kind of like where, like what Maslow's hierarchy of needs is kind of trying to address and trying to explain. But at the same time, it makes some mistakes in that its system doesn't really understand the Mojo phenomenon all that well. It doesn't really take into it. It doesn't take it into account, and the fact that certain mojos, for example, like the interpretives, they value like the more, what would be considered the more farther off and hard to reach things like self-actualization and stuff like that. More like in a sort of like, it's kind of a bit stretching it, but like a little bit like interpretive, a little bit more tacit, motif-based and pattern-based kind of like things. That's kind of like what you would normally think of as being like self-actualization.
That's definitely one popular
way
of saying.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, like interpreters, and all interpreters, they kind of value that as their primary thing or their secondary thing. Whereas in this system, it's kind of like saying that all people are the same, kind of, and they all work in this kind of basic pattern, which flies in the face of like the Nijez, for example, which actually work the exact opposite way. It would roughly like grasp like maybe the Vazez, but even for them, it would not be complete because it doesn't take into account their powers and individual differences between like the Vizi and the Vizai. In fact, that one's a hunter and one's a gatherer, and so all these different things, it just doesn't take the Mojo phenomenon into account at all. So that's a big critique, and I think that there's a few more there too.
Good idea of it.
There's the Mojo phenomenon. There's the 4 channels versus the 5, and I think, I think that kind of gets it. I think I touched on pretty much everything. Did I?
I believe so.
Okay. I just want to double check here. Yeah. Oh, it's the seeker acknowledging the forensic fact of the Mojo phenomenon. Should I hit that one?
Well, you do sometimes. You kind of touched on a little bit when you went over how it can be problematic, but you want to flesh that out a bit, you can go ahead and do it. But you kind of sort of applied the correct way when you talk about the problem.
All right. So a proper truth seeker acknowledges the Mojo phenomenon as a forensic fact and takes it into account with their understanding of how to understand other people, basically, because that's kind of like what the Mojo phenomenon actually does. And so you got to like be able to take the Maslow's hierarchy of needs with a grain of salt, like the way you have to do everything, kind of, and understand it for what it does and how it works and how it can be beneficial and how it can, and also understanding its limitations. And its limitations are quite pronounced. And so one should, as a proper truth seeker, understand that, the way you go about trying to understand people in this kind of a way has to really take into account the Mojo phenomenon, basically. And so kind of, it's very simplistic, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So it kind of basically says that people work a certain way, all of them in a certain kind of like uniform cookie cutter way, and that's actually incorrect. And so you got to be able to challenge your system and incorporate different ideas, different perspectives from different human beings and how they work and how their desires and needs don't work like completely in alignment with the system. And so it needs to be challenged in order for it to grow, and and then from there it can actually start to really grasp everything much more correctly. And then whatever it is that they were trying to do with this model, it will then become that much better if they were to take in all these other principles into account. So that's kind of like a
that's good.
Yeah.
All right, we'll move on to the artist's way. What is it? How can it be helpful? How can it be a problem? How does a truth seeker understand it?
All right, so the artist way is a methodology meant to assist people in gaining self-confidence and harnessing their creative talents and skills, with a correlation made by some practitioners between artistic creativity and one's spiritual connection with God. This can help a person understand what an excellent conduit to higher truth the artistic process can be. It becomes problematic when the artistic process is defined without accounting for the innate qualia of a person's mojo and its peak pathway, which fundamentally influences everything they do, including their artistic process. And also there is the issue of equating a higher truth connection through art to a specific deity or conceptualization of divinity. A proper truth seeker understands that the study of any process of the human condition, including the artistic process, falls under the overall process of peaking according to one's mojo design, and that connection to higher truth through the artistic process has been observed in just about spiritual belief.
We adjust that sentence. Has been observed in many spiritual belief systems on record.
Okay. Including those that are atheistic, trans-atheistic, or do not even consider theism a real question.
Yeah, and transtheistic.
And trans-theistic. I said trans-theistic.
I think you actually said trans-atheistic.
Oh, I said trans-atheistic. I'm not actually sure what the artist's way is. I think this is the first time I ever heard of it. Or I think I may have heard of it before, but it's kind of like an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's kind of got two things to it. One is, which is how it's done a lot of times by New Agers. Basically, kind of like being a Kensei with art and using art as your way of understanding existence and kind of pulling out from yourself your own inner truth.
Okay.
So that can be cool. It is also sometimes linked with finding your inner divinity, connected with a divinity of like a god. And so that is also a way that the artist way is done. I think I don't know exactly. I think the artist way, the original person may have made the connection, and then other people may have separated it. Because I know a lot of New Agers that have done artist way kind of stuff, but they don't do the God thing. But I also know that some do that.
Yeah, it does very much sound like something that's New Agey, yeah.
So it's basically art as self-exploration, and that is connecting to possibly divinity. The camera's not working again. I'm not sure why. The camcorder one. and it lied to me because it came on, it saw me, and then it turned off and said, "Camera's not recording."
And when you click on that, what's it do? Can I?
Yeah.
Okay.
But it actually saw me. So
Or coach saw himself through it.
yeah, it did. The way the camera always looks, you know, the camera recognized the environment. You know, I mean, I actually saw my head moving. It was me, and then, psych.
Yeah. Probably some kind of a code issue. Software. Are you still there, coach? Oh, man. You left there for a second.
Yeah, I said so. Maybe near me. But
I
maybe.
can still hear you. Can't see you still.
Okay.
All right, I think I want to try the artist's way here.
All right. Maybe it's reboot or something.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right. So the artist's way is a methodology that assists a person in developing confidence and understanding their artistic process and getting a person more in touch with I would think like their spirit forms in a way, in a way where they're able to relate to them in a more personified kind of a manner and that sort of thing. Artistic kind of appreciation of themselves and how they work and that sort of thing. So this is beneficial because it can lead to a lot of understanding and growth about oneself and how they do what they do. And it's related to like spirituality index to a certain degree, and appreciating that side of it. And also, I guess maybe the interpretive and values-based powers, because they're spiritual. I think
they can be seen that way, but obviously, actually, all powers really have that.
Are artistic in their own way, yeah. So it's beneficial in a lot of ways like that, but at the same time, there's certain issues that come up with it as well, in that it doesn't take into account the Mojo phenomenon, which is a reoccurring theme with a lot of these models of thought. They just don't know about this new revolutionary ideology that is Podler, this omni theory. So because of that, they don't understand that the artistic process is actually working with the peak pathway and the overall peak way processes that are taking place, and those are actually the more major themes that are actually involved in how a person thinks and how they do what they do. And the artistic process actually works with that as the fundamental given, essentially. And so if that is given more importance than the individual and how they actually work themselves, the artistic way, that is, then that can lead to issues. So it becomes more of like trying to make them fit into a way of thinking that may not necessarily work for them, as compared to themselves and how they are meant to flow and meant to peak properly, and then using that as the given and then working with that in mind. And then if you do it that way, then you'll always be led to the right answer. Also, at the same time, there's also this connection that's made with one's artistic process, and how certain people who practice the artist's way will associate that with like a connection with some kind of like a deity, or connection with divinity, and like I can see what's going on there. It seems like they're getting something out of it, which is very spiritually like fulfilling, but it doesn't necessarily have to be one where you must have that as a given when you're practicing the artist's way, because there's many examples of other systems where other systems of the artist's way where the person isn't necessarily connecting to a deity in that kind of a way. They're actually atheistic, or they're trans-theistic, or they don't even consider the question of theism a relevant question or an important question. So there's all different kinds of ways in which you can approach it that way, with not necessarily being a theist or having some kind of a belief in a god or a divinity as being a requirement in order to practice the artist's way. So, yeah.
Got it. Nice. Number 3, what is humanism? How can this concept be helpful? How can it be a problem? How does a truth seeker handle it?
All right, so humanism is a philosophical and ethical stance that emphasizes... Hold on, let me just chew my food.
Yeah.